Shalom. This is Shimshon Rubin, and I'm recording a very brief introduction to the two-track model of loss and bereavement for professionals in mental health and for interested persons who the issues of loss and bereavement are important to them. So I am director of the International Laboratory for the Study of Loss, Bereavement and Human Resilience at the School of Psychological Sciences at the University of Haifa in Israel, and a professor of psychology in the psychology department at the Max Stern Yezreel Valley College in Israel. So I would like to share my screen and pick up from there. So this is ways to reach me for information, and let's proceed. So the two-track model of bereavement, and I use this slide with a picture of the Chamluli sisters that hangs in the Tate Gallery in London to describe my initial understanding of the two-track model of bereavement by comparing mothers who had lost children to sudden infant death and mothers who had lost children to sudden infant death years earlier, together with a control group of mothers who had living children. What I discovered in that research, which initially was my doctoral research and later became my first article on the two-track model of bereavement, is that there are different ways to try to understand bereavement and that a double focus is most useful. By the year 1999, there were over 20 years of research and writings, clinical work, theory, and outcome of bereavement with different populations who had lost family members, and the reference in that 1999 article is up on the screen. So briefly, the two-track model of bereavement says there are two tracks that are important for us to understand and think about loss and bereavement. The first one is related to biopsychosocial functioning. It is very much a part of the stress and trauma literature. When I was trying to understand the long-term effects of bereavement and the short-term effects of bereavement, the literature was helpful in the area of stress and trauma. It describes bereavement as one of many different things that can be a major life stressor. The event is bereavement. The category is things that force us to make major changes in our lives. The process is one of accommodation, which means we get used to it and we are able to function. And the typical outcome is homeostasis with no residue or no negative difficulties, no problems of note, but there are often problematic outcomes or imbalance of symptoms. I want to put up a slide by Calabote, and this is a slide of the floor scrapers, and these are people who are basically scraping off varnish from the floor, and this hangs in the Musée d'Orsay in Paris. And what it is, for me, is a visualization of how some people think about bereavement and adaptation to bereavement. And they take a measure and they will ask how much, in this case, how many square meters could somebody scrape off varnish off a floor before a bereavement, and then in the months and years after the bereavement, and when they're able to reach the amount of cleaned floor that they had before the bereavement process has ended. This plays out, of course, not with floor scraping, but in much of the research literature, what you have is studies of depression. When depression is high, people say, all right, then the person is grieving. When depression returns to its pre-loss status, then they say, well, it seems bereavement has ended. For children in schools, when their school work suffers, they're still grieving. And when it returns to what had been before the loss, by saying, all right, well, we see here now that the loss has stopped having an effect on them. And very anxiety, many, many different kinds of things have been studied and how they affect people. It's really a very long list, but it is a very partial list, as I will go on to demonstrate shortly. So this is the biopsychosocial. The basic assumptions of the biopsychosocial are track one. is the biological things such as how our sleep is doing, how our nutrition, substance abuse, sexuality, health behaviors, all these things are what we are looking and assessing with people who are coming to us as clinicians, not only after bereavement, not only after trauma, but for many other different things. We try to get a basic idea of how they're doing in the biological area, the psychological area, their emotions, their cognitions, anxiety, depression, what their self-esteem is like, their meaning construction in the world, their spirituality and religion, and specifically for trauma, the re-experiencing, the avoidance, the negative affect, the arousal and dysfunction are what we're going to be looking at both from a psychological point of view and what they describe to us in their cognitions and emotions, and of course in the biologic. And then the social is our interpersonal interactions, the family interactions and work and school kinds of things. These are what we will be exploring for anyone following a bereavement, following exposure to trauma, and in many cases for people who are just seeking assistance or consultation on their lives. The track 2, the relational bond and the death story, really comes from a different orientation, and it talks about interpersonal attachment, the relationships that people form with each other. It is related to Freud's earlier work. It's related to John Bowlby's major contribution on the formation of relationships, interpersonal relationships in his attachment model. And the event in bereavement is similar to what we talked about earlier, but the category is reworking the relationship, changing the relationship. And the process is how we reorganize a relational bond from someone who is living to someone who is no longer living. For those of us who remember children and how they're growing and how they develop, and when they're very young, they need to be very close to their parents. And then as they get older, they don't need to be physically close to their parents, but they have a sort of formed an intrapersonal, an inside bond with the parent that they hold on to even when the parent is not immediately close by. So the transition, the transformation of a bond from one that's physically connected to one that is relationally connected to the person that they hold inside is what we're talking about. The process of grief and bereavement does that. The typical outcome of grieving and mourning is the ability to access inner presence and balance of relationships with the person who passed away, the person who died, the person who was killed, all kinds of different ways that people can die. And problem outcomes is when there's no inner balance, there's no inner access to it. So the relational bond is some of the things we're talking about. We're talking about what is in the literature since the 1990s described as continuing bonds with the deceased, and not the breaking of bonds or the ending of bonds with the deceased. And the death story is what we try to understand is how the person died. And this is very important because in cases of trauma, in cases of homicide, for example, and suicide, how people died, in cases of terror, how people died interferes with the ability to connect to the inner story, inner connection and memories with the deceased. So that would be the track 2. And a picture that kind of conveys this also from the Tate Gallery in London this time is the picture of the Saltonstall family painted by David Degrange. And what it is a family where there is the father, there's 2 children from his first wife who has passed away, and she's lying down on the bed there. A second wife with a 3rd child. And this is the family picture, what that hung in the salon in their house in the early 1700s, 1600s, and actually, and that it is the family depiction of who's in the family, and everybody in the family looking at that picture. The 2 children from the first wife, their mother is in the picture. She's important. The second wife knows that there's an earlier woman who had been in the family and who is remaining as an important aspect of the family history and needs to be related to and needs to have space made for her. And even the new baby here is going to be growing up understanding that there was a mother of biological mother of his two siblings that was important. And for the father, there's a relationship with the new wife, but there's also a continuing relationship of different things, of memories with the deceased wife. So these are things we want to understand. We try to understand the nature of the ongoing relationship from within to the person who passed away. So the basic assumptions of the track 2 is that there's a death story, that how people talk about what happened to the person who died, how it occurred, what they share can give you a lot of information about whether it is a death that they experience as particularly difficult to integrate, it's a death that they feel responsible for, it's a death they cannot talk about. These are things that we will want to understand. And the second part, and the more ongoing, continuing part, is the interpersonal bonds, the ongoing memories, emotions, axis of the relationship that occur across the life cycle. But certainly the first days and early weeks, these are things that are not so easy oftentimes, and certainly in times such as tragic times such as war, or acts of horrible, horrific deaths, as we've seen in Israel on October 7th, that the death story can interfere with the ability to remember the person who died in a supportive, important way. So the two-track model says, look, we need to be looking at those two things together always, the biopsychosocial on the one hand, but not to think that if we understand that people are no longer having symptoms, that the grieving has ended. On the contrary, we want to understand what they tell us about the death story and how the relational bond is experienced across time. And both of these things are important to assess, and how we hear, how people tell us about these things is going to be important for how we design intervention. This schematic seismographic diagram gives you an idea of how the 10 items that I've listed here on track 1, biopsychosocial functioning, and the 11 items starting with the death story difficulties on the track 2, relationships with the deceased and death story, play out over time. And in the same way that assessment over time means that you measure the ups and downs and the power and the waning and waxing of each of these items, each of these elements, this gives you an idea of how to think about loss across the life cycle, and not just in a particular framework that's looking only at symptomatology. So I've given you the reference here for the Rubin, Wilkinson, and Wheatstone article that appears in the Frontiers in Psychiatry in the year 2020. It's an open access, and it explains, gives you more information about traumatic bereavements, and it gives you information also about intervention and some of our points of how to intervene. The death story idea, I wanted to just share with you two more pieces of art that I think are important to help us understand bereavement. This is William Blake's description of, or depiction of, the soul parting from the body, beginning in the 19th century. And what you see is a body resting in repose in a very calm fashion, and that the soul is lifting up and going up to resume to become closer to God. Blake was a religious man, and that this is, if you can think about somebody dying like this, this is helpful, it's soothing. Their soul continues, their soul is going up. But the next picture is one of trauma. And this is a detail from Pablo Picasso's drawing of Guernica, which he produced after the horrific Nazi Stuka bombing in the Basque town of Guernica. And he is showing a mother who has lost her child to this horrific event as part of a much larger canvas, which hung for many years in the Museum of Modern Art in New York before being returned to Madrid when the regime changed and Franco was no longer in power. So the living is now dead for Guernica is also, I think, true for mothers who lost children to sudden infant death under conditions of middle class, modern living, where there's a crib and in the nursery, and their child sleeps there every night, and things are going wonderful. And then one day they walk in and they discover their child has died without any hint of why. And this experience is so shocking and so traumatizing that it is, even though it's under conditions that one would think of as not extreme, the loss of a child, loss of a young child to death is horrific, and it's incredibly powerfully painful and shocking for the parents who have lost a child. So when we think about traumatic loss, we need to also keep in mind that certain forms of bereavement have that same power, even if they're not characterized as objectively traumatic. And this talks about really looking at trauma focused or relationship focus in this time period, certainly in Israel and many other countries that are at war. There is the middle circle is grief complications. On the left, you have the trauma focus. We want to understand how the trauma plays out in their experience of what happened to them, what was occurring to them when they were in the situation that they were in when they learned of the death and later. We have the relationship focus on the right, which is saying that one of the things we're going to look at is always how people connect with the person who died, their memories of them. On top, we have death circumstances, which impact biopsychosocial functioning on track 1 and also are important for the death story on track 2. And then on the bottom, we have the relationship notion of continuing bond and trying to understand how the continuing bond is being experienced at different points in time. So this is our 2012 book by myself, Ruth Malkinson, and Eliezer Wietztum. We have a 2016 book in Hebrew, which is greatly expanded. We have articles that continue to be accessible in the literature that give you bits and pieces of our thinking. But for those of you who want a more in-depth thing, I suggest going for the book. And I want to thank you for spending these minutes with me and learning about the two-track model of loss and bereavement. And I hope that you'll find it useful to you. Thank you.